Greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, and the global climate is changing. Despite current federal inaction, local municipalities are starting to think about how to adapt to climate change and its effects on their communities. But planning for these risks is not as cut and dried as one might expect. Inevitably, politics enters in.
So climate change is really all about thinking about how risks are changing as the climate changes, and that raises the risks of all kinds of things, some of which are undesirable. They're problems that we want to avoid, like floods. And so thinking about how to adapt to climate change is really an exercise in thinking about how to manage different kinds of risks and what investments we ought to make now to reduce those risks.
It's almost newer assets that you're building. It's almost easier for those. You can just say, well, you must build to this higher elevation. But something that's already there, there's flood protection measures, but a lot of those can get very costly very quickly.
Well, governments for sure think about risks on an actuarial basis like this, looking at the probability of the risk and the magnitude of damage when the event occurs. They don't always act like insurers because they don't always bail people out.
The government doesn't always bail people out. In the case of floods, FEMA established a subsidized flood insurance program. But those not contained within the 100-year flood zone won't reap the benefits of the program.
Well, FEMA maybe isn't planning necessarily for climate change, but they do plan for floods, right, which happen all the time, and they're not just due to climate change. So the question was, can we study how communities react to potential increases or changes, I should say, in flood risk?
It turns out community reactions to flood risk don't follow the efficient cost-benefit analysis that an economist might make.
The key point here is that the conversations that are happening around flooding, around these flood map processes, are often not focused on the risk of flooding or of climate change down the road, but are focused on the cost of flood insurance. And my argument is that this is due largely because the mapping program is embedded in an insurance program. And so the conversations at the local level all often devolve down to, what is it going to cost my constituents?
FEMA, when they do these studies to determine what those base flood elevations are, they're not considering climate change. So they're not really adding sea level rise and looking to what the base flood elevation or the floodplain might be in 100 years from now.
Communities that have been remapped to show increased flood risks oftentimes push back against that. And oftentimes, not always, the result of these appeals is that the flood zone is shrunk, or the base flood elevation is lowered, or the risk is lowered.
Not only do politics get in the way of adapting efficiently to flood risk, but uncertainty comes into play, making adaptation efforts more difficult to implement.
When there are a lot of uncertainties, it makes the payoff from any investment less certain. And when the payoff is less certain, it reduces the incentives for people to undertake the investment.
Big adaptation investments are expensive and require people to think far ahead in the future, something that we are not really equipped to do.
So political science research shows that disaster relief, securing disaster relief for your constituents, wins you a lot of points and votes with your constituents and voters. Taking preventative measures and trying to mitigate future disasters does not pay off as much electorally.
We assume there's people at the water department that maybe don't really fully believe in climate change, or maybe their job is so intense and focused on a water main break today that they can't really think. It's hard for them to have the time to think 100 years from now.
Those are things that we'd want to start doing now, but because a lot of communities may be uncertain about how climate change will affect them or when, they may be slow in rolling those adaptations out.
Instead, communities tend to seek quick and cheap fixes that are easy to implement. such as elevating roadways above the floodline.
But when you look out, 30 or 40 years, a lot of those communities are going to have problems that are much more severe and that can't be fixed by elevating the roadways, right? That's a short-term fix that has the disadvantage of signaling to people that the problem is under control, even though when you go out a few decades and sea level has risen further, there's just no way that those communities will still be habitable.
Communities becoming uninhabitable is a serious risk, and politics and uncertainty may prevent cities from protecting themselves. But some cities, like Philadelphia, are finding creative ways around these barriers.
We're very interested in what's called adaptive management practices. So it's a way of letting you, if you need to build a flood wall or a structure along the coast to protect from flooding, maybe you don't spend all the money to build it up to 12 feet, whatever it is, but you actually build the base wide enough that you could in the future. So you only build it half of that height, but the base is large enough that you have that option in the future to build it higher if you need to.
There is a disconnect between the policymakers creating the regulations and the practitioners who are trying to implement them.
So much of what we do at the water department is regulatory driven, and there aren't really regulations specifically about climate change. I mean, we know that climate change is going to make it harder for us to meet those regulatory targets in the future.
But there's a difference between the bureaucrats and the elected officials. And so sometimes it's the elected officials that are pushing back a little bit. They have shorter time horizons.
Right now, we're not at the point where our work is driving city policy or changing regulations, but it may in the future. It's a little bit of growing pains. We're trying to figure this out. It's sort of like everybody's trying to figure out how to incorporate this climate information. And we're all sort of doing the best we can and trying to sort of coordinate.
Communities are doing the best they can, but without federal support, it's going to be difficult.
I just think there's not a big constituency for this. I mean, that's one of the things we look at as political scientists as well, is like, who's arguing for this? There's floodplain managers do. FEMA's a big advocate of it. But who else is clamoring for better flood maps, right?
Federal funding has been very important for entities like NOAA, and federal funding provides grants for academic researchers that are doing studies on this stuff. So I think we're going to see that slow down drastically. I think you're just going to see a lot of really important research that's happening on small scales just at universities and partnerships with local municipalities. That's going to start drying up. We're going to keep working on this. And so are cities around the world. So are cities across the United States. I mean, we're really taking the leadership. Sort of these urban areas, these mayors are really standing up, and it's going to keep happening whether it's federally funded or not.